Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Friday, May 22nd. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on today's Federal Drive, the way nations use technology is changing, and so is the work around it. Cyber isn't just about defense anymore. Governments increasingly assume they'll use offensive cyber tools as part of state power. Plus, even as AI gets better at finding digital weak spots, it doesn't eliminate the human role in cyber conflict. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Trump administration is looking to overhaul federal employees' avenues for appealing adverse personnel actions. As that gets underway, former officials from the Merit Systems Protection Board are warning of significant consequences for the civil service. Here with more detail is Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Anytime, Terry.
Let's back up for a minute as we think about what these changes are. What exactly has the Trump administration been planning to change for the federal employee appeals process?
These changes have been occurring over the last several months. The Office of Personnel Management has proposed regulations in 3 different areas that would change the appeals process for federal employees. This would be in cases where federal employees are removed due to a reduction in force or an agency RIF, a probationary firing, or a suitability action. So in those cases, if a federal employee believes that their agency incorrectly or wrongfully terminated them, employees can appeal those actions. Generally, how it works and how it has for many decades is that the Merit Systems Protection Board, or MSPB, handles those cases and issues decisions on whether or not it was a wrongful termination. But these new proposed regulations from OPM would move that authority away from MSPB and into OPM internally itself. So a pretty significant change here for federal employees.
What is that going to feel like in practice? I mean, one appeals chain versus another doesn't sound like a big difference. How is this going to play out?
In addition to there being a change in what agency is overseeing those decisions and handling those appeals processes, there's also going to be a change in what that process actually looks like. So OPM, in addition to moving the authority to itself, is looking to remove what's called a discovery phase for those cases. So employees there wouldn't be a period where there's information collected, and it would only be as needed that OPM would run an investigation into the situation. Federal employees would also lose their right to have a hearing in most cases, and instead OPM would rely only on the written record. And then there would also be more limited opportunities for employees to petition the reconsideration of a decision on their appeal. So a lot of the steps of the process are essentially being taken out here for a majority of cases. And again, these are proposed regulations, so nothing has changed yet, but this is clearly where the Trump administration is looking to go. Raymond Limon, who is a former MSPB member under the Biden administration, he retired in 2025, and he's been raising concerns that OPM's actions are not aligned with what congressional intentions were of the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act. He describes in his own words what federal employees stand to lose under OPM's changes.
You lose a neutral adjudicator, someone who doesn't work for the agency that fired you. You lose the right to a hearing with live testimony. You lose discovery. You lose federal court review. OPM would be simultaneously writing the rules and judging your case under those rules. And it's all being done through either executive orders or OPM regulations. Congress hasn't done anything to change those laws. This is very troubling.
Drew, what are the other concerns that MSPB officials have brought up? They're kind of being written out of the process.
If this was to happen and take effect, there are a lot of concerns from former MSPB officials, as well as many other organizations in the federal space, worry that there will be essentially a conflict of interest with OPM, as Ray Limon mentioned, being both the start and the end of the process. There's also concerns that this is going to erode due process for federal employees and remove transparency into appeals just by having fewer steps in that process. It's raising concerns, of course, too, that employees will be losing a shot at a fair decision and a fair hearing of their appeals. We also heard from Richard Vateris, who's a retired MSPB administrative judge, and he explains his position on this.
Obviously, as a retired MSPB judge, I would not want to see that happen because the board, you see, is an independent agency that doesn't have a dog in the fight. Board judges independently review what happened against the regulation. And there's an argument that if you take that authority away from the board and give it to OPM, that there's a greater danger that agency actions would be rubber stamped.
A little bit like the fox guarding the henhouse, so to speak.
You could say that, yes.
What does OPM say about why they're making these changes then?
The Trump administration and OPM say that this would streamline and make the process more efficient. They also say it would reduce costs not only for agencies and employees, but also for the taxpayer, and that it would ease the burden on agencies who are having to deal with appeals as a result of adverse actions that may be taking place. There was a recent opinion article from Noah Peters, who's a senior advisor at OPM in Bloomberg Law, and he talked about the idea that this would be beneficial to employees who, he said, would no longer have to navigate what he called a convoluted process at the MSPB. And he also argues that there is, under this 1978 Civil Service Reform Act precedent, or it, it just follows that OPM should be the one to be making these decisions. So he was pretty strongly advocating for the idea of transferring this jurisdiction away from MSPB and again to OPM.
And OPM is also considering changes to the RIF process at the same time, right?
That's right. So these the changes for the appeals process do include RIF actions, but then there's also more broadly changes to the RIF process itself. So there's a separate proposed regulation from OPM and the Trump administration that would change the order of retention register when an agency does a RIF. Right now, their tenure and seniority are usually prioritized when conducting a RIF and determining who gets to keep their jobs and who gets removed. The Trump administration is looking to flip that around to have performance be the top factor for consideration and the priority for whether or not to keep employees during a RIF. They said that by having performance, it would help keep employees who are doing their job well versus those that have simply just been there for a long time. But there have been concerns as well with that area, just saying that it would have negative impacts on federal employee expertise, recruitment, and retention, and some questions about whether there's truly evidence that changing that order would produce better outcomes in a RIF.
Are we at the stage now where we just need to wait on the draft regulations and see what the specifics will be?
All of these proposed regulations are exactly that. They are proposed. They're not finalized yet. So there's been public comment periods for all of these where we're going to see how people are kind of responding to what's been proposed or planned here from the administration. So the next steps would be we'll eventually see final regulations or rules come out on all of these at some point, potentially later this year.
That's Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. Drew, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks, Terry.
You can find her full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, cyber isn't just about defense anymore. Governments increasingly assume they'll use offensive cyber tools as part of state power. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Offensive cyber operations have moved from the margins of national security into the core of how governments plan for conflict, deterrence, and competition. That shift means agencies are building cyber capabilities into standing strategy, and industry is increasingly expected to design, operate, and protect systems with the assumption that cyber operations are a normal feature of state behavior. Kat Summer of NCC Group is here to share more of their recent findings and recommendations. Kat, thank you so much for joining me. It's really great to have you on the show today.
I'm very happy to be here, Terry.
We talk a lot about cyber on this show. We have a lot of folks who are deeply engaged in doing cyber every day. And I think it's easy, certainly it is for me, to slip into thinking about cyber as a technical problem. NCC Group has just released its 5th edition of the Global Cyber Policy Radar, and I think it tries to make a case that this is not just a technical problem. Tell us how you all approach the cyber security space.
So it's a really good point, because yes, you're right. Traditionally, we look at cyber, or people have looked at cyber as a technical issue. What we're trying to work out in the Global Cyber Policy Radar is the way in which that conversation has shifted. And it's shifted in 2 ways in our view. One is cyber has very much become an instrument of geopolitics. And we talk about the geopoliticization of cyber. And the other way in which we talk about it is that cyber has moved from the IT backroom into the board agenda now, because of the way in which governments around the world, regulatory authorities around the world are now holding boards and senior executives responsible for cybersecurity and cyber resilience outcomes.
Well, let's take those each in their own conversation. This idea that cyber is now a tool of international diplomacy, what does that mean in terms of offensive and defensive strategies, and how are you seeing governments move?
So I think the context for a lot of that is that we live in a very digital world nowadays. So the foundations of our economies, the foundations of our societies are basically driven by digital technologies now, which means the cybersecurity and cyber resilience of those technologies underpinning everything that we do has become more easily disruptible. The way in which governments used to think about cybersecurity and cyber resilience was from a preventative point of view. So if you look at a lot of regulations that we've seen published over the last couple of years, they're very much focused on putting minimum baseline cybersecurity requirements in place, really getting organizations to try and prevent a cyber breach as much as humanly or technologically possible. Nowadays, there has been a very clear shift of, I think, primarily led by the US administration, actually, about governments looking at disrupting adversary behavior. So rather than just focusing on building up the walls of defense, it's being more forward in trying to disrupt adversary behavior, going on the offensive, as it were. And the way in which I think we're seeing that shift play out in particular is that is no longer just a state action that is happening, but there are increasingly governments looking towards the private sector to help those efforts and help that undertaking. That's to an extent not always been the case, but we talk about a whole of society approach. In cyber, we talk about public-private collaboration, public-private partnership. Up till now, that's primarily focused on intelligence sharing or information sharing. We feel like we're now moving to a point where governments might well ask a private sector operator of critical infrastructure to take part in an offensive cyber operation.
That's a pretty significant shift in roles, responsibilities, and outlooks.
Yeah.
When you think about that, integrating cyber capabilities into broader military and geopolitical strategy, where do you see the risks around coordination, escalation, and maybe miscalculation?
It's a really good point. And that is one that we make in the radar, one that different countries are embracing greater offensive cyber capabilities, but doing so on a very national, very nation state basis, part of the broader fragmentation of geopolitics that we're seeing around the world. So there is necessarily an international consensus, despite UN efforts to try and build one and try and build the norms in cyberspace. So what might be acceptable in cyberspace and in offensive operations for one country isn't necessarily the same for another country, which means the rules of the road are really unclear. That's the one risk, and the one risk of fragmentation. The other risk, particularly for private sector firms being asked to do that, is being unprepared for that question to arrive. So part of the argument that we're making is to say to firms, you might well expect your government to ask you to partake in an offensive cyber operation. What will your response be? Have you thought about the legal implications? If you're a multinational, have you thought about the legal implications in each of your operating jurisdictions? Have you thought about the morals, the ethics of that? Have you got a process that you will go through to decide whether you politely decline that request or whether you feel like it is acceptable to say yes to that request? So having done the pre-thinking before that request comes is a very important aspect and a very important recommendation that we're making to organizations.
Kat Summer is Group Head of Government Affairs and Analyst Relations at NCC Group. Kat, you just began to touch on the private sector implications here. What are you seeing play out in terms of the responsibilities and the liabilities for private sector leaders and board members?
It's a really interesting question, and it touches upon, I guess, the other part in which we're seeing cyber move out of the technical sphere into a broader area of responsibility. Up until now, we've always talked about cyber being the responsibility either of the IT manager or the chief information security officer. We've seen moves in pretty much most of the Western world by governments saying to company boards, to executive directors, to chief executives, what exactly is it that you are doing about cyber resilience? How are you ensuring that your organization is now a responsible cyber player, that you have got your house in order when it comes to cybersecurity? And part of that has been done through regulations. So the Network and Information Security Directive #2 in the European Union, for example, introduces the concept of director liability, and various European Union member states have actually implemented that in their transposition. So there is now things like board members needing to undergo cybersecurity training and needing to prove that they have done that so they know which questions to ask. We've seen in the UK, the Chancellor of the Exchequer write to FTSE 350 stock market listed organizations, boards, chairs and chief executive, asking 3 simple questions about what they are doing with cybersecurity. And they have had, I think, about 50% of organizations respond to say, yes, we are on top of things. Thank you very much for asking. So that's the shift that we're seeing, and I think the very clear expectation, the very clear message by governments to those business leaders, organizational leaders, is you can't delegate that responsibility. You might delegate the execution of the technical detail, but if you get hit and you're found to have been negligent in terms of the preparations, is your head on the chopping block rather than that of your head of security?
Kat, this report was, I presume, predominantly prepared before ongoing operations in Iran and the Middle East began, kind of in February. What are you seeing there that is supporting or refuting the thesis in your report?
We believe that the argument of cyber having become a tool of statecraft and a tool of geopolitics is being supported by looking at the way in which cyber operations are being integrated into wider military operations. So rather than it being a separate domain, it is now part of a whole of state response and a whole of state action in those conflict situations.
It's one thing to watch munitions explode in ongoing operations, but cyber is this invisible behind the scenes activity. How can leaders, military leaders, national agency leaders, think about getting ahead of this, think about making it real? Who needs to be at the table for future plans?
Really good question. I think I would go back to saying it is a whole of society response. It's a whole of society effort. Making cyber real ultimately is the responsibility of everyone who touches parts of technology, parts of organizational response, parts of military operations. So one of the key elements to think about is finding that shared language and being able to ensure that everyone around the table, no matter what domain they represent, no matter what expertise they have, they understand the implications of a cyber attack, of cyber defense operations, of cyber offensive operations, so that there is a common ground from which decision making and conversation can take place.
I've been speaking with Kat Sommer. She's Group Head of Government Affairs and Analyst Relations at NCC Group. Kat, thanks for making a topic that is sometimes a bit nebulous, a bit more concrete for us today.
Very welcome. Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, even as AI gets better at finding digital weak spots, it doesn't eliminate the human role in cyber conflict. And then as cyber and AI reshape national security, the Naval Postgraduate School is building those changes directly into how it educates its students. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Security teams have long chased known vulnerabilities, but AI is accelerating how new ones are discovered and exploited in a world where cyber operations are already part of state competition. Here to walk through how that changes the balance between attackers and defenders is Associate Professor of the Practice of Cyber Studies at the University of Tulsa, Justin Miller. Mr. Miller, it is so nice to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
We've read a lot of headlines lately about Anthropic's new AI model Mythos and the alarms it is setting off. When a company limits access to its own AI tool out of fear of misuse, that's likely to get fast attention. When you think about what's happening now, what does that reaction tell you about how tools like this could or are changing the cyber threat landscape?
Well, I often look at cybersecurity through people, processes, and technology. That's how I kind of frame that. And we're getting to a point now where we have to understand that technology, as we have our really smart people working on that, we have to be able to make sure that we have the right personnel who can govern that and understand the responsibilities of this cyber ecosystem that allows us to operate with ethics, morals, and understands the abilities that AI can bring into our cyber domain and what effect that could happen. So making sure that we understand policy, how to govern that. We need those people in cyberspace that'll help us stay forward thinking, stay right, stay moral, stay professional. That's what when you ask me that question, that's what I think about.
We'll come back to those topics in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about the AI piece first, because security researchers have hunted software vulnerabilities for years. What's different about AI-driven tools like Mythos, for example, that can identify previously unknown flaws at scale and speed?
Well, AI it's a capability multiplier, right? And 0 day is a specific undiscovered vulnerability. And to be able to think faster, we need artificial intelligence in some ways to help us seek out these vulnerabilities. That hidden weakness can be extremely dangerous, and we have to be able to identify the sophistications in it quickly and start sounding that alarm a lot faster. And I think that's where AI can help us if we're using it for the right reasons, directing to the right purpose.
It seems like you have to have AI to respond to AI because human brains don't work that fast. So what is the danger of an AI escalation here?
Well, it moves fast, right? So it dramatically accelerates how vulnerabilities can be weaponized. But on the flip side of that, AI can accelerate how vulnerabilities are discovered, defended against. So you almost have machine on machine, and that's where we have to be able to train it most appropriately. And hopefully our cyber policies and governance personnel are doing a better job than our adversaries in training their AI versus our AI.
Let's come back to the ethics and morals question, because in my simple brain, offensive cyber is done by the bad guys and defensive cyber is done by the good guys. But when you think about these new kinds of AI-enabled capabilities, based on your experience, who's most likely to exploit this capability early and why?
Well, given my background, I'm always looking at the nefarious angle. And with AI, when we look at cyber criminals or rogue nation states, AI lowers the barrier to entry for some of their cyber operations, and it increases the speed and scale of their attacks. But one thing I've learned over time is that we're going up against a trained, practiced adversary. And as we train our students in our universities, they're becoming better later in life. And when they graduate and go into these jobs in industry, into our cyber ecosystem, they haven't really been exposed to that fast-paced, fast-level trained adversary. And the on-the-job training is a critical element to see that. I tell my students that they're lucky if they can get into a breach investigation right away, because everything's into the real world environment. And everybody, I think there's an old adage that says everybody has a plan until you get smacked in the mouth, right? And that changes the whole dynamic. And being able to go up against trained, practiced adversaries and combat that efficiently is kind of that's the drive that we're producing here at the University of Tulsa. And I think every cybersecurity student, practitioner needs to continue to practice. They need to continue to upscale, train, because they are going up against trained, well-funded adversaries who are focused, and they've been focused for many years trying to potentially bring down the United States.
Justin Miller is Associate Professor of the Practice of Cyber Studies at the University of Tulsa. Mr. Miller, if attackers, as you just described, are well-funded, organized, practiced, and faster now, how does that change how agencies and organizations really need to approach detection, patching, and incident response?
There needs to be more practical applications in the classroom, right? And then we need to increase that stress level. And as we've trained our students, we're finding that as they come back from industry, they're saying, hey, you're sitting as wicked smart people, but they have a hard time communicating technical knowledge in a fast way. And that's what we're practicing in our classroom, is we're putting you behind the computer, giving you practical exercises, and simultaneously asking questions and forcing you to communicate what you're doing in real time to effectively produce what we're hoping will be faster responses in the real world out in industry.
Does this new capability tilt the playing field, I guess, in the direction of offensive cyber operations by nation states?
I think nation states are going to be offensive, right? And the United States is, I think, overall our strategy. If we think back to 2010, we initiate Cyber Command, and because we started seeing that there was a fifth domain, right, in our military operations, where we have land, sea, air, space, but now cyberspace, or the cyber domain, becomes that fifth domain that kind of blurred the operational capabilities that we were trying to defend against. Because I think that the toughest part of that is we have private networks and public networks that are all intertwined over the internet, that a lot of our critical systems are attached to. So trying to partner with all of these networks that are protecting transportation, hospitals, utilities, telecom, logistics, finance, right, cloud dependencies, that creates a large-scale ecosystem that the United States, by recognizing that in 2010 with Cyber Command, and then you see I would call it the Russian influence operations of the 2016 presidential election, and then that kind of led the United States to 2018 building CISA, because they're recognizing that it's not only technical operations, but it's influence-based as well, and that this cybersecurity is beyond machine to machine. It's now offensive in the sense of influencing, and you're seeing that today, right? This morning, the report was that Iran responded to via their social media page, right? So cyber is grown exponentially in, not only is it zero-day attacks, machine to machine, but you're seeing offensive influence operations.
What kind of organizations or activities do you assess as most vulnerable to these kind of offensive and influence operations?
I think you can look at our transportation sectors, our utilities, our water, our telecom, and that's where when we look back at people, processes, and technology, I think the people have a very strategic partnership in that. And it's those people that we need to pay attention to, because, the late night janitor or the midnight shift rep at the utility plant or the water purification plant, whose only job is to sit there for 8-10 hours and look at a screen and manage network flows. Those people are very critical, that the people and the process that they play in managing the network. And it's those individuals that I think have the key insights into our critical infrastructure, where we look at our water, our utilities, our hospitals, and we want to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table. When we're talking about cyber, one thing I've seen when we sit in the room is there's a lot of lawyers in these rooms when we're looking at things, and not a lot of technical people. And when we look at cyber operations, and a lot of times I would ask I want to see the physical security personnel. I want to talk to the janitors. I want to talk to the midnight personnel and see what they're looking at to help us kind of further understand what was going on in the system. So that whole ecosystem, there's a lot more to cyber than just the IT personnel, your cyber personnel. That holistic approach, everybody in that corporation, that company, has a role to play. And whether you're the janitor or a systems monitor, I think there's value in seeing what they're seeing about accessing the company every day, whether that's from physical security, parking, to cyber operations. There's value in assessing your people.
You spent 25 years as a Secret Service special agent. What worries you most about the cyber world we live in today?
Really, what worries me most is a cascading effect between multiple actors. When you see the combination of China, Russia, Iran most recently, and North Korea, those four actors, over the past 25 years of my career, I've seen and experienced investigations that were linked to those individuals, nation states. And we know they're in their telecom system. We've seen that. The Iranians, tried to hit the Bowman Dam. They are showing more capability with their cyber operations. But that cascading effect of all four of those actors coming together to try to target us at one time, I think would be scary.
I've been speaking with Justin Miller. He's Associate Professor of the Practice of Cyber Studies at the University of Tulsa. Mr. Miller, really appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, as cyber and AI reshape national security, the Naval Postgraduate School is building those changes directly into how it educates its students. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. At the Naval Postgraduate School, about 50% of research funding goes directly into the students' education, a reflection of how quickly those mission demands are changing. Whether it's artificial intelligence or unmanned vehicles or a host of other topics, NPS is following a simple motto. If you want to educate somebody at the forefront, you've got to be at the forefront yourself. For more on how the Naval Postgraduate School is turning innovation and research into education, Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller, talked to Dr. Michael Hesse, the school's vice provost for research and innovation.
My portfolio is to do that, to support research from all aspects of it. The management aspect, if you like, the mechanical support aspects that any organization, any university has in order to manage funds and parse them out. But then also to interface with sponsors, basically decision makers who set the course that we should evolve in, to focus the research, to broadcast what we're doing, to basically try to convince sponsors to support us, as needed, and then to engage the faculty, to get them excited about new opportunities, to get them engaged in new directions that, like we heard from the CNO a couple of days ago, the marching orders that everybody adheres to, and so do we. We don't do research for any purpose. We don't watch the grass grow, right? We're doing research for a purpose. It's a mixture of applied research and fundamental research that looks over the horizon, where we're going and what are the navies and service needs in the future, as well as, hey, what's out there that we can take now and apply pretty quickly. We see ourselves often as a front end, as a de-risker, if you like, for our partner organizations like the warfare centers and other Navy and service organizations that we work with. And another role in my office is to support partnerships. Partnerships are critically important to success. Partnerships can be, and obviously with industry, and here this meeting was really an eye-opener about, for me, who's still on the learning curve here as a newbie, what's out there, what we can leverage here, bring into the game for the benefit of our research and our students, and ultimately for the benefit of the Navy. And in addition, we partner with other Navy organizations. I mentioned the warfare centers, where we have many partnerships, Naval Research Center and so on, and Naval Research Laboratory, and then also other academia and other government organizations. One partnership, obviously, dear to my heart is with NASA, so that's one. I think there are quite a few opportunities to explore there. I'm going to be looking.
Let's talk a little bit about your research priorities. What are some of those areas that you're starting to delve into for 2026 and beyond?
Obviously, we want to continue to align, because we're already very well aligned with naval priorities, things like AI. I was actually really amazed coming to the school about the existing focus on AI. And I'm saying this even though I'm coming from a NASA center that was for the longest time NASA's lead center in AI development, right? So still the school has this enormous focus on AI, which is utterly appropriate, because, we apply that everywhere, from knowledge management, to making operational decisions, to interfacing with humans, and shaping how humans can beneficially interact and maintain decision authority in an environment where autonomy and AI is more and more necessary in order to address the needs of the field where we're operating, right? So these things, directed energy weapons is another big topic that we're doing here at the postgraduate school. Autonomous vehicles. You heard SecNav this morning talking about deploying autonomous vehicles and having that work in conjunction with crewed vehicles in a beneficial way. That's something we are working on through programs like Cruiser, that we have that is supported. I mean, these are really, really exciting and necessary opportunities that we are pursuing. Of course, space, I can't not say space. Space is important for the Navy in so many ways, from position navigation, timing, to reconnaissance, to detection, and even in communication, of course, over the horizon radar, things like that. Space always plays a role in this. So supporting space research is going to continue to be a priority for the school, as it has been, because it is a need that our customers have and our students need to be educated in order to address it. So these are some snapshots, right?
There's a lot there to dig out of. Let's give people, in case if they're not familiar, a lot of your research priorities, a lot of the areas are driven by the CNO, driven by the Secretary's priorities and strategies they put out, but you also get requests from commanders and others that say, hey, we have a problem we need help solving. Maybe just describe that process, because like something like AI, right? There's 101, there's probably 1,001 things you could do. So how do you say, let's do this one or this five or however many research projects you have in any of these one categories? That's
a very good question and a difficult one to answer, right? The decision-making process as where it can go or where you want to go depends on a number of factors, right? First of all, what can you actually do? You may get a request from a commander, say, I need this. And then the next question you have to ask yourself is, what role can I play answering that question? Maybe I have something on the shelf, or I have a research project that addresses it directly, or something that can be re-vectored into that direction to provide what you need, or you may simply not have the expertise. Biological science, for example, even though I did that at Ames as a leader of that organization, we don't do that at Ames, right? So if there's a need to do that, we can maybe help find somebody to support. But there are other things in AI where we can say, hey, we have that knowledge. We're getting it. We're getting the capability, for example, with the NVIDIA GB300, we could tailor that and address this problem. And all the way along that, and I was emphasizing synergistically with education. Our students provide operational knowledge that we can feed into and we do feed into our research projects, and they walk away with that knowledge. Dual track transition to operations, like I always say, the ordinary research track, you do research and we do lower TRL, but you then work with a company or a customer somewhere else to make it higher TRL and bring it into operations. Okay, but there's the mind of our students. They take that knowledge with them. This is a different track that only we really can provide, right? So to zoom back out again to your question, right? So what you do is, hey, what can we do to address that? What is the impact? Okay, what is the requirement that we need to meet? Do we have the resources? That's another question that we, of course, have to ask. But if we can address it, we will. But, a healthy research program does two things. It addresses short to midterm and then also long-term. I like to call that the seed corn, the long-term research, right? The long-term, maybe high risk too, right? Long-term research can be high risk, but the research is looking forward, not what we need now, right? What do we need 5 years from now, 10 years from now? That's critically important to keep that vision open, so that you and the Navy are ready to address that when that need arises. Project forward, but together with, hey, we want to show that what we are doing has impact, right? So, and that means we will address questions like, can you do this for me readily? To come to the Naval Innovation Center, this is a key facility to make that happen, to go from, hey, ideation, take a napkin, right, on the back of a napkin. We did that at NASA, actually, believe it or not. Write down some ideas, how can we do this? Then test them out, evaluate them as you go, right? This hedge fund concept, which I like very much, don't keep doing what's not working. That's just a waste of time and money. But reinvest, redirect funds and support to where it matters.
Dr. Michael Hesse is the Vice Provost for Research and Innovation at the Naval Postgraduate School. He's speaking there with Federal News Network's Executive Editor, Jason Miller. You can find their full conversation at federalnewsnetwork.com. Search Ask the CIO. Lawmakers are renewing their efforts to give service members the ability to fix their own equipment after popular right to repair provisions were stripped from the 2026 Defense Policy Bill following strong industry pushback. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more details. Anastasia, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Terry.
So what is the latest in this ongoing discussion?
Yeah, so two senators, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren and Republican Senator Tim Sheehy, wrote to the leaders of the Senate and House Armed Services Committees, urging them to pass the Warrior Right to Repair Act through the fiscal 2027 Defense Policy Bill. Now, they've been pushing this effort for some time. We've been talking about it. The bill they introduced last year sought to require contractors to provide the Defense Department what they call fair and reasonable access to all repair materials. Now, what made it into the 2026 Defense Policy Bill was they wanted to require contractors to provide the military with detailed repair and maintenance instructions. Now, ultimately, that didn't make it into the final 2026 Defense Policy Bill. And then, of course, there was another right to repair provision in the House version of the bill, which would require DoD to negotiate access to technical data and necessary software before signing a contract. None of those reforms made it into the final bill, but at the same time, they had wide bipartisan support. They gained a lot of momentum last year. They were backed by the Trump administration. They were backed by defense leaders, but ultimately they were stripped from the final bill, following a lot of pressure from major defense contractor lobbyists. And lawmakers now are saying that they will continue to push this reform this year. And so it's budget season and Congress is going to mark up the NDAA, so they're renewing this push.
Are there new factors in their case? Are they advocating for different considerations, or is it more of the same?
It's kind of more of the same. They compiled testimony and statements from senior military officials over the last year who have publicly backed giving the Pentagon the ability to repair and maintain their equipment, making the case again this year. They compiled kind of the same examples that we talked about of what happens when the military doesn't have the ability to repair their own equipment. So, for instance, the Navy spending thousands of dollars to fly in contractors to make simplest of repairs, or Marines stationed in Japan waiting for months for repairs on engines that had to be shipped to the United States, or, for example, the Air Force paying $900 per page for upgrades to maintenance manuals. They just highlighted all of those statements from defense military leaders and kind of all of those examples. Here's the Navy's Chief of Naval Operations testifying in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee last year.
It's so ridiculous that sailors cannot actually enter a piece of equipment because of a contractual reason, a warranty violation. It goes right to the heart of what we call self-sufficiency. So I don't like it in peacetime, and I certainly do not want it in wartime. It's not sustainable. It's dangerous. There should be nothing on board a ship that a sailor cannot repair. It's just said that simply. And that's how we make sure that we're ready to fight. Things break all the time on our ships, and to keep them going, sustained. And that's why this is just not just a wartime. We need these equipments. I mean, it's dangerous where we operate now, even in peace. They're not there just sailing around. We're actually acting as a deterrent. We're a vital part of that, at the ready. And so when a piece of equipment's down and our readiness is not 100%, and it's because I can't repair it, then that's unacceptable in my mind.
Anastasia, if the arguments in favor of right to repair are still pretty much the same, one would assume that industry's argument against it would be pretty much the same. What was that argument last year?
So last year, for instance, the Senate required contractors to provide detailed instructions for repairing equipment. And industry came back and said, look, instructions for readiness that Congress wants DoD to have include data, tools, and software for operations, maintenance, installations, and training, which could have sensitive and proprietary technical and manufacturing data and IP developed at the contractor's private expense. And they also made this case last year that these efforts would hinder innovation and DoD's access to cutting-edge technology because it would deter companies from contracting with DoD over all these concerns of forcing disclosure of IP. So it's kind of the same old decade debate.
It feels a little bit like trench warfare here. What do you think is next? Are we going to stay in the trenches, or is there a way to break out?
We'll be watching what provisions the Senate and the House are going to introduce this year because, like I said, this issue did gain a lot of momentum last year and a lot of bipartisan support. It felt like some of those efforts would make it into the final bill. Lawmakers are saying they're not giving up. They're going to continue. But again, industry groups spent tens of millions of dollars last year lobbying against this legislation. Here's Republican Congressman Pat Harrigan.
We did get right to repair last year. Myself, a former Green Beret, Tim Sheehy over in the Senate, a former Navy SEAL, Elizabeth Warren, and Maggie Goodlander. You probably couldn't find 4 different members of Congress that disagree more on various parts of policy, but we all agree on this. And we actually brought this across the finish line in last year's NDAA, both in the House Armed Services Committee and in the Senate Armed Services Committee, and magically through a very opaque process called a conference, a bunch of unelected bureaucrats kicked it out of last year's NDAA, and we didn't get it done. So I want everybody to understand that every single service wants this. This committee wants to give it to you. But for some reason, there is some force that is out there that is preventing that from happening. That's a shot across the bow. I'm going to start getting very agitated about this year, but we have to deliver right to repair to the services. We absolutely have to have it.
So we'll be watching how successful they are this year. But like I mentioned, there is a lot of force behind it that is lobbying against it.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Thanks for bringing us this story.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.